February 16, 1944. The sun rose over Truk Lagoon with a deceptive calm, gilding the glassy water and palm-fringed shores in honeyed light. From above, it looked like paradise, an untouched haven in the Caroline Islands. But anyone standing on the decks of the Japanese cruisers anchored in the lagoon knew better. Ships, from heavy battleships to modest cargo vessels, waited silently, their steel hulls reflecting the morning sun like a collection of gleaming tombstones. For the Japanese, this was a fortress, so secure, so isolated, that the word invincible had become part of their daily conversation. Yet far to the east, in the vast expanse of the Pacific Essex-class carriers, USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Yorktown, and their sister ships, were slicing through the waves with a purpose unseen and relentless. Lieutenant Commander James "Jim" Reynolds of the Essex paced the flight deck, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The intelligence reports had been precise. A dense cluster of warships, fuel depots, and airfields, everything the Japanese had thought untouchable, all laid out in perfect formation. Reynolds squinted against the morning glare, imagining the chaos that would soon unfold. "Feels almost too easy," he muttered, though he knew better. Every calm harbor hides danger. Every fortress has a weak point. On the Japanese side, Captain Haruto Nakamura surveyed his fleet from the bridge of the heavy cruiser Chikuma. His men moved with disciplined precision, loading anti-aircraft guns, scanning the horizon for any hint of enemy planes. Rumors had filtered through naval intelligence of U.S. carrier movements, but Nakamura's confidence in Truk's natural defenses, its wide reefs, deep channels, and lagoon walls, was unshakable. "No one can reach us here," he told his officers. But the calm certainty of his voice betrayed a subtle tension. Every sailor knew the truth was never so simple. By mid-morning, the first wave of American aircraft was in the air. From the carriers, the rumble of engines grew into a symphony of war. SBD dive bombers, TBF Avengers, and F-6F Hellcats streamed toward the lagoon, their formations tight, disciplined, almost surgical. From the air, Truk appeared as a model city of ships, each vessel a target, each pier a potential ruin. Lieutenant Reynolds and his pilots felt a strange mixture of awe and anticipation. This was a playground of destruction, but the stakes were human, painfully real. The first explosions broke the morning stillness. Bombs struck the anchored ships with devastating accuracy, sending plumes of black smoke skyward. The Chikuma shuddered as near misses rocked her hull, her crew scrambling to bring guns to bear. Japanese gunners fired furiously, tracer rounds arcing like incandescent threads over the water, yet the planes seemed to appear from nowhere, vanishing into the clouds as quickly as they arrived. The lagoon, so calm an hour before, now boiled with chaos. Reynolds' wingman Ensign Carl Red Donovan shouted over the radio, his voice a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. "It's like the sea's on fire." The smell of burning fuel, acrid and choking, drifted up from the lagoon as torpedoes tore through the water. On the decks below, sailors clutched ropes and rails, eyes wide with fear and a dawning understanding that their fortress was not what it seemed. Amid the destruction, there were moments that no map or chart could convey. A young Japanese sailor, barely 19, dove into the shallow water to escape the flames licking the deck of a torpedoed transport ship. His hands burned, his uniform heavy with seawater, yet instinct and sheer survival drove him forward. Above, American pilots strafed enemy positions, but Reynolds kept a careful eye on the human cost. War, he thought, was never just numbers and targets. It was faces, fear, courage, and the fleeting decision between life and death. By late afternoon, the scale of the attack became clear. Over 200 U.S. aircraft had flown sorties against Truk in a single day. 12 Japanese warships had sunk, 32 merchant vessels destroyed, and nearly 300 planes were reduced to charred wreckage. The lagoon was no longer a serene paradise, but a mirror of fire and steel, smoke reflecting in the waters where once only the sun danced. Captain Nakamura, pacing the bridge of a surviving cruiser, stared at the devastation, a grim knot forming in his stomach. The fortress of Truk was no longer invincible. The myth had been shattered, and with it, a piece of the Japanese command's confidence. Yet even in the chaos, there were strange glimpses of irony. A bamboo shack, masquerading as a hangar, exploded harmlessly under the bomb's weight, leaving pilots chuckling in their headsets despite the destruction around them. The lagoon, so idyllic in postcards, had become what some Americans would later call the graveyard with a view, a place where the beauty of nature collided violently with the machinery of war. As night fell, the last aircraft returned to the carriers, engines whining and wings heavy with fuel. The U.S. pilots looked out over the smoldering lagoon, exhausted but exhilarated. Lieutenant Reynolds allowed himself a quiet smile. "We've opened the door," he said softly, "and the rest of the Pacific is waiting." On the Japanese side, Captain Nakamura stood silently, listening to the distant crackle of fires and the occasional groan of a hull giving way beneath the waves. His men were battered, shocked, and disoriented. The belief in Truk's invulnerability had crumbled, replaced with a grim awareness that the war was shifting, that mobility and surprise could unseat even the most fortified positions. Somewhere deep in the lagoon, lives had been lost, ships had burned, and the future of the Pacific would never look the same again. And yet, as smoke rose in lazy spirals toward the twilight sky, a sense of inevitability lingered. The story of Truk Lagoon was far from over. What had begun as a daring strike by Essex class carriers was only the opening act, and both sides knew in their hearts that the next moves would shape not just a battle, but the course of an entire war. The morning of February 17, 1944, arrived over Truk Lagoon with a sky streaked in pale gold and bruised clouds. Smoke from the previous day's inferno still rose in jagged columns, curling above the water like black fingers reaching for the sun. For the Japanese forces who survived, the sight was both terrifying and surreal. Ships that had seemed untouchable now lay twisted and smoldering, and the very lagoon they had trusted as a shield had become a graveyard. Captain Haruto Nakamura moved from the bridge of his remaining cruiser to inspect the shattered docks, his eyes scanning for signs of regrouping, for some miracle that would restore a sense of control. There was none. The calm he had relied on was gone, replaced by chaos, desperation, and the unyielding knowledge that the enemy had arrived with overwhelming force. Far out at sea, Lieutenant Commander James Reynolds prepared the next wave of Essex air groups. The pilots were tired, but determination hung over the flight deck like a tangible weight. Reynolds knew that Truk's defenses would not simply lie dormant after yesterday's shock. They would adapt, and the Americans had to strike harder, faster. "We hit hard once," he told his wingmen. "We hit harder now. No hesitation. The lagoon doesn't get a second chance." The men understood. Their nerves were taut, fingers gripping controls, as if every heartbeat mattered more than the last. As U.S. aircraft ascended, the lagoon below was alive with frantic movement. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries belched smoke and tracer fire, arcs of red and gold slicing the sky in desperate attempts to intercept the incoming planes. Pilots felt the heat of explosions beneath their wings, shrapnel scattering the water like molten metal. Ensign Car Red Donovan shouted over the roar of his engine, "They're still trying. Crazy bastards, but they're trying." Reynolds allowed himself a grim smile. "Yes, and we'll make them wish they hadn't." The battle unfolded with precision. Torpedo bombers struck the remaining transports and supply ships, while dive bombers targeted fuel depots and repair yards, reducing them to molten wreckage. Fighters strafed runways and strafed the few planes attempting to rise into the sky, turning airfields into impossible mazes of twisted metal and smoke. The lagoon, once a picture of idyllic serenity, had become a canvas of fire and steel. Amid the destruction, human moments shone sharply. A Japanese sailor, barely conscious, clutched a floating beam to keep his head above water as explosions rocked the lagoon around him. Across the water, an American pilot banked sharply, glimpsing the young man's struggle before diving toward a nearby target. Reynolds had briefed them all, mission first, mercy where it could be given, but the war did not pause for compassion. In that instant, the ocean held both life and death, beauty and horror in equal measure. The statistics were staggering. Over the 2-day operation, more than 60% of Japanese air capacity at Truk was destroyed. Dozens of ships, both military and logistical, had been sunk, burned, or rendered inoperable. Task Force 58's after-action reports would later record over 200 sorties, nearly 300 aircraft destroyed, and hundreds of lives altered in an instant. Yet behind every number lay fear, courage, and the unpredictable human element that no chart or report could ever fully capture. Even amidst the horror, irony persisted. Japanese troops sometimes mistook torpedo wakes for harmless dolphins, a brief, almost absurd reprieve in the midst of catastrophe. On the American side, pilots exchanged quiet jokes over radios, a wry acknowledgement of the surreal theater in which they had found themselves. The lagoon had become a stage for violence, strategy, and human drama, all under the indifferent gaze of the tropical sun. By late afternoon, on February 18th, the final strikes had cleared the skies. The remaining Japanese forces huddled in what was left of their command posts, counting losses, tending wounds, and absorbing the reality that Truk Lagoon's myth of invincibility was shattered. Captain Nakamura, standing amid the wreckage of his once proud base, realized that static defenses and natural barriers could not withstand a determined and mobile enemy. The war had changed, the rules of engagement had shifted, and the Pacific now belonged to those who could move, strike, and vanish with precision and audacity. For Reynolds and his men, there was exhaustion, yes, but also a quiet triumph. The Essex carriers had proven the power of naval aviation, the potential of coordinated strikes, and the effectiveness of planning married to daring execution. He watched the lagoon burn in the late sun, smoke reflecting in the waves, and allowed himself a rare, reflective thought. Each ship destroyed, each plane grounded, was a step toward shortening a war that had already claimed far too many lives. And yet, as night fell over Truk, there was an unspoken acknowledgement among both sides. This was far from over. The destruction of the lagoon had changed the Pacific landscape, reshaped strategies, and left the Japanese command reeling. But it had also set the stage for even greater confrontations to come. The Essex-class carriers had struck a decisive blow, yet in the vast endless ocean, battles yet unseen awaited, ready to test courage, skill, and humanity once more. The lagoon, now eerily quiet except for the occasional hiss of fires and distant groan of dying ships, seemed to breathe in the aftermath. Smoke rose in lazy spirals toward a bruised sky, carrying with it the scent of fuel, salt, and iron. For those who had survived, for those who had struck, and for those who had watched their world dissolve in flames, Truk Lagoon was no longer a symbol of safety. It was a warning, a turning point, and a haunting reminder that in war nothing remains untouched, and no fortress, no matter how silent or secure, can withstand the relentless advance of fire and steel.